tougher rules. The Trump administration unveils stricter measures for legal immigrants. We're at the White House. Election runoff. A pro-life candidate is set to be the next president of Guatemala. Vatican reform. Pope Francis announces changes at the Holy See's Bank. And last things. The Holy Father has advice on how the faithful can prepare to meet God. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, August 12th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Immigration groups are blasting the White House tonight. They're voicing concern over a new set of rules regulating legal immigration. The policy, announced today by the Trump administration, could deny green cards to those who use Medicaid, food stamps, or housing vouchers. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Wyatt, federal law already requires immigrants applying for legal status to prove they won't be a burden to the U.S. This new rule applies that to a broader range of government assistance programs, and it's part of the Trump administration's wider effort to create a system focused on immigration skills instead of family ties in America.
The White House says the U.S. will now weigh public assistance along with other factors like education, income, and health to determine whether to grant legal status in the U.S.
President Trump's administration is reinforcing the ideals of self-sufficiency and personal responsibility, ensuring that immigrants are able to support themselves and become successful here in America.
The new rules take effect in mid-October. They do not apply to U.S. citizens. Also, women who are pregnant and on Medicaid or who need public assistance will not be subject to the new rules during pregnancy and for 60 days after birth. Still, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is concerned.
When you hear the bishop's concern, does it give you any pause when you consider carrying out some of these policies?
I would say as a Catholic, one of the things I'm proud of is that my church has been one of the best supporters of people in this country before we had a welfare state. So I don't see that changing, and I don't see any conflict with enforcing the law as it's written.
The church's teaching on immigration is complex. Catholic social teaching says governments have a duty to welcome the foreigner in search of a better life. But it also says countries have the right to secure their border and enforce the law for the sake of the common good.
The Catholic Church considers immigration an issue of prudential judgment, meaning the faithful can form their own opinions about what policies are best. There's no doubt this issue is provoking debate amongst the Catholics here in America. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. The Trump administration will soon begin enforcing one of its pro-life measures. Officials have set a timetable for federally funded family clinics to comply with a new rule barring them from referring women for abortions. The rule goes into effect next month, but a federal court in San Francisco plans to hear arguments in a lawsuit to block the action. The details of how accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein died in his Manhattan jail cell over the weekend have yet to be released. Medical officials have performed an autopsy on the high-profile inmate who is believed to have taken his own life. And although Epstein is gone, the legal battles linked to him remain. The FBI has started an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's death.
He was probably the highest priority and highest profile person in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons at the time. And second of all, he had reportedly had a recent suicide attempt.
Today, Attorney General William Barr says the Justice Department has already found, quote, serious irregularities at the federal jail. Earlier, he said he was angry to learn staffers at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York had, quote, failed to adequately secure this prisoner.
It is very difficult to understand how he was not on a suicide watch and how this happened without some involvement of those who were responsible to hold him safely.
Epstein was reportedly found with marks on his neck July 23rd and was placed on a suicide watch. Psychologists took him off suicide watch at the end of July, according to a source familiar with the matter. On Friday, unsealed court documents revealed new allegations of sexual abuse claims against Epstein and several associates. He was dead the next day. And although Epstein is dead, the alleged crimes linked to him are still alive.
Anyone who helped Jeffrey Epstein run this sex trafficking ring, promote it, profit from it, should still be very worried. Southern District has made clear, we're not done. We're still coming after the co-conspirators.
Epstein's lawyers released a statement saying they were enormously sorry to learn of Epstein's passing, adding no one should die in jail. No official cause of death has been released thus far. Join me now to take a closer look at all of this is John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax. John, the investigation into Epstein's apparent suicide raises concerns about conditions within U.S. prisons. How much pressure is the Justice Department under right now to get to the bottom of this?
I say it's increased a lot in the last 48 hours. Certainly the idea that a high-profile defendant who should have been under suicide watch, from whom the suicide watch was removed at the request of his lawyers, is going to be looked at quite deeply. And remember, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of charges out there and a lot of hurt that need to be investigated.
We'll just follow up with you on that. What recourse is there for his alleged victims to seek justice? And what about his punishment for his alleged co-conspirators?
Obviously, a civil suit is there and an investigation into who was involved with Epstein and the degree of the crime was there. Look, in 1941, Abe Reles was considered the star witness against Murder Incorporated, the mob in New York. And he began slowly giving evidence until he went out of a hotel window in November of that year. But that didn't stop authorities from going after Murder Incorporated and pursuing it for years after. I imagine that the Reles precedent, that when the star witness is gone, will apply to the Epstein case when the defendant is gone.
President Trump has had no official response to the news of Epstein's death, but he retweeted 2 posts of conspiracy theories that the Clintons were somehow involved. Many of the president's critics, of course, calling him irresponsible for doing that. What's your reaction to that?
If Melania Trump is watching our program, and I hope she is, I would just say, with great respect for the First Lady, take away that Twitter machine for a little while, okay?
Before we let you go, I want to switch gears. I want to ask you about one other topic, which is the administration's decision to move forward with this public charge rule that Mark Irons had just reported on.
Yes.
It linked the immigration status to income, the use of public assistance programs today. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that the president is someone who takes seriously the promises he made in the campaign. He promised immigration reform, and this is something that's dealing with legal immigrants at this point. Now, it is up to Congress to decide whether it's going to expand it, and one can say that the administration took action through the executive because the legislative branch had taken no action. Now there's obviously going to be some pressure for them to do something one way or another.
Okay, well, both stories we're going to continue to stay on top of, very important topics. John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, Wyatt. Always a pleasure.
A conservative doctor wins Guatemala's presidential runoff.
Pero especialmente que Dios bendiga Guatemala.
Alejandro Giamatti is pro-life and supports traditional marriage. He received 59% of the vote. The new president will take office in January and will face the task of attempting to stem the large flow of migrants headed to the U.S. At least 66 people are dead following flash floods and mudslides in India. The disaster was caused by several days of torrential rain in the southern part of the country. It forced 360,000 people to move to relief camps. There also has been extensive damage to property and livestock. Pope Francis says he is praying for the victims. Muslims in India mark the Islamic festival of Eid today. The holiday celebrates the Prophet Ibrahim and his unwavering faith in God. Hundreds prayed at a New Delhi mosque built in the 17th century. During the festival, Muslims slaughter livestock and distribute the meat to the poor. They also greet friends and family with gifts. Authorities in Australia are investigating a letter posted online to see whether it was written by Cardinal George Pell. That letter may breach rules forbidding prisoners from posting on social media or using the internet or asking others to post on their behalf. Pell is the highest-ranking Catholic official to be found guilty of child sex abuse. He denies the allegations and is appealing the conviction. Pope Francis issues new reforms for the Vatican Bank. The new statutes call for an external auditor. Previously, all auditing was done internally. The origins of the bank go back to the late 19th century under Pope Leo XIII. Alan Holdren is the EWTN Rome Bureau Chief. He joins us now from Rome. Alan, what's new in these statutes?
Well, Wyatt, the Vatican is now going to be looking to an external auditor, whether a group or a person, to replace the 3 internal auditors that they had in this Vatican so-called bank previously. That's meant to take on corruption from the outside, to make sure that there's no sort of insider dealings there, no temptation for that. Also, the commission of cardinals, 5 cardinals that oversee this Vatican bank, is going to be renewable for a 5-year term. So Pope Francis brings them on for 5 years, possibility to return for another 5, but it's not an indefinite sort of appointment. There's also going to be a boost up to 7 lay members of the advisory board for this commission that's selected and put in place by the commission itself.
Well, as you alluded to, in recent years, the Vatican Bank has been embroiled in financial scandal and corruption. Just last year, the Vatican indicted the bank's former president for losses of more than 50 million euros. Realistically, Alan, will these reforms really solve the problems like corruption?
Well, that's what Pope Francis wants to do. He said from the beginning of this whole reform effort of the Vatican that finances was a major part and priority of the reform process. The man sort of behind the message at this point, Andrea Tornielli, the Pope's editorial director for Vatican News Media, said that this is an important step to both maintaining international standards and also going back to that original mission of fidelity to the original mission of this Vatican Bank, which is to support the charity of the Pope and the work of the Catholic Church. And so the case that you mentioned, the idea and the optics of this as well is that the Holy See is addressing that case and others through this new direction that was started really under Benedict XVI and has continued now to bring the Holy See financial operations up to international standards.
Alan, you mentioned the Vatican Bank was originally founded to do charity work. What is its role nowadays?
Well, Wyatt, the origins of this so-called Vatican Bank date back to 1887 under Pope Leo XIII. He started it off as a commission, and it was enshrined in its current format, its current institution, as the Institute of Religious Works under Pope Pius XII. It was started to facilitate the transfer of funds between Vatican departments, works of the Holy See worldwide, including religious congregations, dioceses in the world, individual bishops and priests, also members of the Vatican staff here. And it was meant to make it easier to do the work of the church in the world because it was all internal transfer of money. That continues to be an essential thing for the Holy See to do its work in the world. And so whereas all of this is meant to increase the transparency and bring the Institute up to international standards, it doesn't mean that this institute isn't of essential use to the Holy See and to the Church today.
We'll continue to keep our eye on all the reforms going on with the Vatican Bank. Alan Holdren, EWTN Rome Bureau Chief. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. What?
Coming up, an update on the ongoing protests in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Airport, one of the world's busiest, canceled all flights today after a massive pro-democracy demonstration. Thousands of protesters crowded into the main terminal. They want democratic reforms and an independent inquiry into police conduct. China's central government in Beijing called the movement something approaching terrorism. Gordon Chang joins me now by Skype from Toronto. Gordon is an expert in Asian foreign policy, and he's the author of The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, welcome back to the broadcast. These protests in Hong Kong were sparked by a proposed bill that would have allowed extraditions from the territory to mainland China. That bill has been tabled for now, but the protests have continued for 10 straight weeks. What's continuing to fuel the unrest?
Well, there are a number of things. First of all, the demands have escalated. So they've gone beyond just the extradition bill. Now people are talking about true autonomy for Hong Kong, and people are actually even talking about independence from China. And some people are even saying that there should be an end to communism on Chinese soil. What's really fueling this is there's been antagonism between Hong Kong and China for quite some time. But China has actually tried to encroach on people's freedoms, on their autonomy of the territory. And so it was just sort of a tipping point where people felt, this is the last stand. This is where I defend my home. And because of that, the attitudes have hardened considerably. And it's not just the protesters, but Hong Kong people have now taken a much tougher stance toward China.
Catholic leaders, including the retired Cardinal of Hong Kong, have been supportive of the protesters, and Catholic and other Christian students have played a big role in the movement. Do you think Beijing fears the role of faith-based groups that they're playing in all of this?
Yes, of course. And the reason is China is afraid of all faiths right now inside China itself. Under Xi Jinping, the current ruler, they're not only going after the Muslim Uyghurs, which they've done for decades, but now there's a relentless attack on Christianity. And what is really fascinating, Xi Jinping is moving against non-Tibetan Buddhists. Non-Tibetan Buddhists were generally thought to be a homegrown, safe religion, but now they are under attack as well. So when you have, for instance, groups of people of faith in Hong Kong who have joined the protests, that sort of adds to what Beijing sees as the threat.
A spokesman for the Chinese government in Beijing issued a statement saying the people of Hong Kong must say no to lawbreakers and stop the violence. What challenges do these protests pose for leaders in Beijing? And do you think there's a possibility we'll see military intervention?
Well, there's always the possibility that there will be more intervention, either the People's Armed Police or the People's Liberation Army being deployed to the territory. But Wyatt, there is growing evidence that mainland Chinese police forces or military are already deployed in Hong Kong. There's that video from about 3 or 4 days ago which shows a Hong Kong riot officer, and he's from Hong Kong. You can tell because he's speaking colloquial Cantonese, but then he turns to other riot police and starts talking in Mandarin, the language of the mainland. And also he addresses them as comrades. He wouldn't use that term for other Hong Kong-based police. So I think that we're seeing mainland officers, either Army or People's Armed Police, already operating in Hong Kong wearing the uniforms of the Hong Kong police.
Okay, well, it doesn't look like the tensions are diffusing anytime soon, so we'll continue to keep our eye on the story and the situation in Hong Kong. Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China, thanks very much for your insight today.
Thank you very much, Wyatt.
Up next, we hear about a lawsuit involving transgender athletes in Connecticut. Pope Francis tells the faithful to use every moment as a way to prepare for our final encounter with God.
Per vivere bene questa vigilanza.
At his Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father said we should abandon ourselves with simplicity and trust to the will of our Lord and let Him guide us to our next goal. Church officials in Wisconsin are speaking out against a proposal attacking the seal of confession. Lawmakers there may consider 2 measures to protect victims of child sexual abuse. One would force priests to report child abuse learned during confession. The bills do not yet have a sponsor. They must have one by next week. Federal officials are investigating Connecticut's policy allowing transgender high school athletes to compete as the gender they choose. The Federal Office for Civil Rights announced the probe last week. In June, the families of 3 girls filed a complaint saying their daughters were discriminated against. They competed in track and field against 2 athletes who were identified as male at birth and have male hormones and muscle structure.
It's giving the transgender females the right to compete with biological females, and eventually it's going to get to the point where the biological females will be on the sidelines watching their own sports.
Selena Sewell is a sprinter at Glastonbury High. She consistently has finished behind the 2 transgender athletes. Christina Holcomb is a lawyer with Alliance Defending Freedom, known as ADF. ADF is representing the Connecticut female athletes. Christiana, just give me the overview here. What's the basis of your complaint?
Well, female athletes deserve to compete on a level playing field. In fact, that's what Title IX was explicitly passed to provide them with. But when you allow biological males to come in and not only compete in, but to dominate women's sports, that's a clear Title IX violation. And so we're grateful that the Department of Education has decided to take up the complaint.
The Connecticut Association of Schools, the athletic conference, says its policy follows a state anti-discrimination law which says students must be treated in school by the gender with which they identify. The law seems to be sort of backfiring here in this specific instance against female athletes.
I think you're exactly right. And not only do I think they're misinterpreting Connecticut law, but that does not take away their obligation to comply with federal law. And in this case, federal law has been really clear that girls have a right to compete on a level playing field. These are the opportunities Title IX was designed to provide them with. And Connecticut is taking that away from Connecticut female athletes.
One of the transgender athletes says having a physical advantage is no different from someone going to a personal trainer to improve. How do you respond to that?
Well, with all due respect, I think both science and common sense tell us that males have a physiological advantage over females. That's in fact the whole reason that we have women's sports in the first place. And frankly, the facts in this case bear that out. One of the biological males who is competing against women in Connecticut was frankly a fairly mediocre as a male athlete, switched to start competing in the female competition and is now dominating women's sports, completely obliterating female athletic records.
I'm sure this is upsetting to so many people to think that we even need to have this conversation. Connecticut is one of 17 states allowing transgender high school athletes to compete without restrictions. How would you like to see this resolved? What should happen with the whole situation with transgender athletes?
Well, ultimately what we're looking for here is a return to fairness and a level playing field. And while the ultimate solution now rests with the U.S. Department of Education, we know that no solution can truly be fair if it results in a biological male coming in and taking medals or podium spots or athletic opportunities or even scholarships from deserving females.
Okay, well, like I said, this is a case that has implications across the country, so we'll continue to follow it and, of course, follow everything with ADF as well. Christina Holcomb, lawyer with Alliance Defending Freedom, thanks so much for the update.
Thanks for having me.
Finally tonight, a Catholic gymnast wins her 6th U.S. championship. Simone Biles not only won, she made history. She became the first woman to complete the so-called triple-double in competition. The 22-year-old heads to the World Championships in October. She also has her eye on the 2020 Olympics. In 2016, she won 4 gold medals. Biles says she always carries a rosary in her gym bag. Not a bad idea just to have a rosary tucked away wherever she goes. And that concludes our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.